Welcome back. Honestman here to discuss Wuthering Waves. Specifically, I want to talk about the Endgame and how it's just not fun. And I want to be very precise about what I'm referring to here. I am not talking about obtaining echoes. I think that's completely fine. And I am not talking about the supply of echo experience and or echo tuners. There are problems there, but those are really just symptoms of a deeper problem. If we solve the deeper problem, then I think the current state of echo experience and echo tuners is fine. What I am talking about when I say endgame is the mechanic of rolling random substats on echoes. Rolling random substats is not fun. Obviously, that's a subjective opinion, but I would assert that people who think random substats are fun are a tiny minority, if they exist at all, and the preponderance of players, given a choice, would prefer to be able to build echoes exactly how they want without any randomness. That is clearly the most enjoyable, most fun option with literally zero downside. Now, I don't think that should be a hot take, but there are people who try to take the opposite view. For example, they say that if players could effectively build their echoes however they want, then the game would be, quote, too easy. The problem with that argument is that it presumes that the developers wouldn't make any additional changes, which is effectively a straw man argument. My expectation isn't that they'd remove random substats and continue to balance things the exact same way. My expectation is that removing random substats would benefit the devs just as much as it benefits the players, because it would empower the developers to make better decisions when balancing content going forward. Making player power contingent upon a random mechanic is bad design, full stop. Random mechanics affecting player power is bad because it could mean that a player isn't able to overcome content based solely on bad luck, completely outside of their control. That's not a good experience, it's not fun, and it disempowers the player. It wouldn't be a good game unless we were specifically talking about a roguelike. Baking randomness into gameplay that isn't fundamentally predicated on randomness for fun ruins the cake. It's a bait and switch. And I can put an even sharper point on that. Just because gacha games have a slot machine for getting new characters and weapons does not mean that it's appropriate or desirable to put a slot machine into the combat mechanics. And by putting a slot machine into a player's ability to build effective echoes, it puts the developer into handcuffs with regards to new or ongoing content creation. They can't create challenging combat encounters for the lucky players because it would alienate everyone else lower on the bell curve. And even if they target the middle of the bell curve, they're still alienating half the players through absolutely no fault and no control of the players themselves. So if a developer has thought about any of this, they'd understand that they have to target the lowest common denominator. They have to try to balance against the bottom of the bell curve so that they don't alienate a significant portion of the player base. But when they do that, by definition, they are not able to create challenging content for the majority of players. Now, let me take a step back for a second before continuing, because there's a broader context here that's really important. If we were not talking about a random mechanic, then the developers should be targeting the average player. They should be targeting the middle of the bell curve when they're making design decisions, because it's those players, the average players, that will sink or swim your game. If the average player isn't having fun, then your game has failed. But psychologically, the middle of the bell curve only works if the playing field from the perspective of the player is otherwise even, or at least fair. If the playing field is not fair, if players are being gimped because of a random mechanic that's completely outside their control, then the correct mitigation is to target the bottom of the bell curve, not the middle. This is part of why randomness in a system that doesn't explicitly rely on randomness for fun is bad design. And the best case scenario is to not create those balancing problems in the first place and to not inject randomness into a system that doesn't derive fun from that randomness. All of that said, the idea that removing random substats from Wuthering Waves would make the game too easy is not only not true, it's actually the opposite of truth. The only way for us to get interesting, challenging content without alienating a large portion of the player base is to remove the shackles from the developers so that they don't have to balance to the lowest common denominator anymore. They could have a very clear and accurate understanding of the expected power level of the players and then balance combat appropriately. Now, to be fair, I don't think the devs have been doing a great job of balancing combat to begin with, and maybe they'll continue to do a poor job of balancing combat even if they had a better handle on the players' power levels. But I don't see any logical argument that removing a variable and crushing the bell curve on echo loadouts isn't a step in the right direction. It's going to simplify the problem and make it easier for devs to balance content and make interesting and challenging combat scenarios. So I think the concerns about combat balance are well-founded, but the random substats are a big part of what's creating that problem in the first place. I assert that eliminating random substats would have a net positive effect on combat balance. Continuing the theme of things that affect the endgame and ultimately limit the success and fun of this game, let's talk about the gacha system itself. The fact that the character banner has a 50% chance of giving you the featured character sucks. Anything that limits access to characters in a character-driven game is bad design. This is cancerous to both the long-term and short-term health of the game. In the short term, there are absolutely players who rage quit when they don't get the character that they're really excited about. In the long term, it creates what may feel like an insurmountable barrier for new players. They think, I'll never catch up, and then they may well be discouraged enough to not even try. So, anyone who wants to try to argue that the 50-50 is somehow a savvy business move to squeeze money from players, that's simply not true. Wuthering Waves has not, in fact, discovered some new and novel way to monetize players who quit the game or who never pick it up in the first place. The formula for making a profitable video game has literally never changed. It's fun equals profit. That's it. It isn't more complicated than that. Sure, we could talk about marketing and things outside of the game, but within the context of the game itself, it's just that simple. Fun equals profit. In spite of that, I'm continually amazed at the number of white knight apologists, especially within the gacha community, who rush to defend things that are not fun. And it's not even that they'll disagree that something isn't fun. It's often not a question of subjective taste at all. They'll acknowledge that something isn't fun, but then they'll proceed to defend it anyway. As I mentioned with the 50-50, they'll gaslight people with the notion that things that are not fun, or which are anti-player, somehow maximize profit, which is a complete fiction as I just outlined. The profit from players who aren't playing is zero. Another fallacious argument that I've heard is that these sorts of anti-fun mechanics are just the status quo for gacha games, so I should either keep my mouth shut or just not play. The implication being that I'm the problem for demanding more, for demanding fun, for demanding that a game respects my time. First of all, saying that this is just the status quo for gacha games is factually incorrect. It's not true that all gacha games are antagonistic to their own players and rely on anti-player monetization strategies. For a specific example, we need to look no further than Final Fantasy Record Keeper. By the time this video goes live, Final Fantasy Record Keeper will be celebrating its 10-year anniversary. 10 years. I assert that a gacha game that's still going strong 10 years in has figured some things out, and maybe other games in the genre should take note. Most importantly, Record Keeper does not restrict character access, or more precisely, the barrier to obtaining a specific character of your choosing is very low. Collecting all of the characters in Record Keeper, and there are literally hundreds, is not some monumental task. It's just a normal part of the player progression. You could start playing Record Keeper today and have all of the characters unlocked within 3 to 6 months. Similarly, there's no endgame grind. You sure as hell are not rolling random stats. Don't get me wrong, there's plenty of farming in the early game and the mid game, but the end game is about deploying different team combinations to overcome different combat challenges. That is a stimulating and interesting end game. That is what Wuthering Waves should be modeling after if they want to achieve a comparable level of longevity and success. So the argument that all gacha games treat their players like garbage isn't true. And even if it were true, it's completely irrelevant in a conversation about what ought to be. And if someone wants to argue the particulars of Final Fantasy Record Keeper and say that simply having a character isn't enough for them to be useful, then you're missing the point. Record Keeper is smart enough to understand that gating access to characters isn't a sustainable strategy, so they devised a different axis upon which to build their slot machine. If Wuthering Waves was smart, they'd adopt a similar philosophy, because there's a huge difference in player psychology between not having a character at all and having a character who just isn't as strong as someone else's copy. In Record Keeper, it's about collecting special attacks for a particular character. In Wuthering Waves, the foundation is already there. It should be about collecting duplicates and about whether or not you have their signature weapon. Gating access to the first copy of a character is a tactical and strategic mistake. And again, just like with random echo substats, this has the consequence of throwing a monkey wrench into the developer's ability to balance content and create interesting and engaging combat. They can't assume that you have any limited characters at all. That restricts the sorts of combat scenarios that they're able to create, lest they risk alienating players with puzzles that are perceived to be unfair. And I want to be very clear here because I can already see the strawman arguments coming. I'm not saying that all players should be equal. This isn't an esport. We're talking about a non-competitive, predominantly single-player experience. What I am saying is that there are dire consequences if your player base feels that something is unfair, especially when we're talking about pay to win in a Western audience. There's a very fine line before players revolt and the community collapses. There's a very big difference in perception and sentiment if you're creating content that everyone can clear, which would be deemed fair, versus creating content that's impenetrable for players who aren't paying to win, which would very quickly turn sentiment to unfair, especially if there are meaningful rewards at stake. Within the context of a Western audience, I would assert that the rule is to aim for pay to win more, or pay to win easier, not pay to win. Paying should never be a prerequisite for success within the context of a free-to-play game. And that last point is what breaks the brains of weak men who've been groomed to trade their dignity and self-respect for waifu JPEGs. You never focus your design decisions on the 1%. You never alienate your player base to placate or cater to the minority. Gacha games are not an exception to this rule. The notion that gacha games should make design decisions for whales, when those decisions would be perceived as antagonistic by the rest of the player base, is wrong. It is wrong. That's not how you maximize profit. It's how you kill a game. Show me a game that focuses on the 1%, and I'll show you a game that's dying. Gacha games are not an exception. The average player is the lifeblood of every game. It's not less true with free-to-play, it's more true. Reason number one, again, is that fun equals profit. Fun is defined by the preponderance of your player base. If your game isn't fun to the average player, then you've created a bad game. Reason number two is that literally everyone starts a free-to-play game as a free-to-play player. If you want to maximize the number of whales in your game, the way to do that is by maximizing the number of free-to-play players. And reason number three is that a huge part of the psychology of paying for things in a free-to-play game is being able to distinguish oneself from the poors. If a whale can't derive any social status by contrasting themselves with the poors, then the perceived value of paying drops. This is especially true in a multiplayer context, If the only people playing are whales and there's nobody to show off to, if there's no distinction between different strata of players, then that game is living on borrowed time. And that's also true in a predominantly single-player context. Even if there's no direct social interaction in-game, there's still a community of players out of game. And that could be real-life friends, it could be message boards, etc. But there's still a broader social context. A free-to-play game that doesn't have any free-to-play players, just whales, isn't a victory condition, it's a fail state. In summary, I think that Wuthering Waves has a lot of good things going for it, but as someone who's been playing games their entire life, and someone who's specifically been playing gacha games for a decade, I see some critical flaws in the game's fundamentals, especially when it comes to endgame and high-level play. Rolling random substats is not fun, and it's only going to harm the game as long as it persists. This mechanic should be removed, and players should be able to design echoes to their exact desired specifications. In addition, the barrier to entry to get all the characters is too high. I think the way they're handling weapons is pretty good, but the way they're handling character draws is bad. I think they should get rid of the 50-50 so that character draws work the same way as weapon draws. Or at least remove the 50-50 for the first copy. Make the first copy of a character 100%. If they want to go back to the alternating 50-50 system thereafter, I'm not as put off by that. I also think that 80 draws to pity is insane relative to the supply of in-game currency. Again, juxtaposed with Final Fantasy Record Keeper. In Record Keeper, a guaranteed 5-star on a featured banner costs 50 mithril. You can easily accumulate 50 mithril in less than 1 month, just with login rewards and daily quests. In Wuthering Waves, you need 7 months of logins to guarantee a 5-star. Obviously, both games feature events that provide additional rewards, but Record Keeper gives away way more currency from their events as well. The difference in psychology between I need to save for 1 month and I need to save for 7 months is huge. So in addition to everything that I've already outlined, I think Wuthering Waves needs to either lower the number of pulls until pity, or they need to significantly increase the supply of in-game currency rewards. And this is another situation that's only going to get worse. We are very early in the game right now, so there's still some nominal value in the 4-star items. Those days are going to end really quick, and it's going to feel extremely bad to have to suffer 79 pulls of trash before getting a 5-star. So between the options of increasing currency or decreasing pity, I would definitely lean towards lowering pity. Suffice it to say that access to characters is a problem that's going to hurt and limit the long-term success of this game. It's a problem that needs a solution. Some combination of lowering pity, increasing in-game currency, and or removing the 50-50, at least for the first copy of a character, could all be a part of a solution. This does not mean they can't monetize. It means they need to be smarter and more strategic about how they are monetizing. Don't gate character access. Make the gacha about obtaining duplicates and about obtaining signature weapons. In addition, it's astounding to me that they're not already monetizing cosmetics like different character skins and weapon skins. There are plenty of ways to split the monetization baby in a way that doesn't sacrifice fun. And look, I know they're making tens of millions per month right now. That doesn't refute my point. However much they're making, they could be making more, and they could be bringing in an even bigger audience. If Kuro Games can lower the barrier to entry on collecting characters and remove random echo substats, it would immediately make the game more fun. But perhaps more important, it would put them into a much better position to maximize success and maximize fun going forward. They'd have a game with much less variance, both in regards to which characters a player has access to, and in regards to the power level of their echoes. Decreasing that variance and removing randomness from that variance means that they can more easily create interesting and challenging combat scenarios for everyone. That would position them to formulate an endgame that's actually interesting, engaging, and fun. So those are my thoughts on the current state of Wuthering Waves. I really hope that this game moves the genre forward and doesn't settle for just being marginally better than its direct competitors. I think they're very close to having something that's special, but it remains to be seen if they can understand and react to a Western audience quickly enough to capture the moment. In any event, that'll do it for now. Thank you all so much. Please like and subscribe. This has been Honestman, and I will see you next time.